All right, General Spalding, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for coming.
So, General, the reason we wanted to have you on, first of all, your background is fascinating, and you have this new book. So you're a retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General, served 26 years, B-2 bomber pilot. You completed your career, Senior Director for Strategic Planning to the President of the NSC, you were Chief Architect of the National Security Strategy, and a China strategist at the Chairman of the JCC. And so, to put it lightly, you know a little bit about what you're talking about, and you speak fluent Mandarin. You've written this new book, Stealth War. And one of the themes of the Realignment podcast we talk a lot about here is the reawakening of the American political elite to the threat that China poses, not only just to the United States militarily, but economically and culturally. That's something that you talk a lot about in your book. And particularly you diagnose a failure of the American elite. What are the origins of that failure? Tell us that story.
Well, the origins are really about, we see it quite clearly in what happened with the NBA and really how a general manager tweeted out the support for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Essentially the league censured him. And why did the league censure him? Well, because they make billions of dollars in China. And so if you go around and you look at each of the elements that we that make up globalization or the international order, whether it be finance or trade or investment or immigration or media or politics or the internet or academia, each one of these open institutions in the West are thought of as essentially strengths of openness and strengths of democracy and promote the principles, democratic principles, human rights, civil liberties, rule of law, and that's what keeps the liberal order going, functioning. So as we were looking at this at the Pentagon in 2014 and trying to diagnose why geopolitically the U.S. had less power internationally in multilateral institutions to actually promote those principles, the diagnosis became, well, the system had broken down. So, when I was fast forward to my time in the White House and people would come in and say, well, you guys are destroying, the Trump administration is destroying the liberal democratic order. And I said, really? Can you explain to me what liberal democratic order you're talking about? Because we diagnosed back in 2014 that the liberal democratic order had ceased to function as a democratic order.
Right.
It was an order. It wasn't democratic, and it certainly didn't promote democratic principles of human rights. What it was promoting, if you look at the current UN Human Rights Commission, the opposite.
Yes.
It was almost like the opposite order.
Right.
And so, when you diagnose that this number two economy, the nation that controls the number two economy in the world, fundamentally doesn't support the norms of the international order and uses the might of that economy and 1.4 billion in a market of 1.4 billion Chinese to undermine the order, then you have what we have where in summer of 2017 the EU basically declined for the first time to at the UN to condemn China for human rights violations. So here's a multilateral democratic institution full of a bunch of NATO allies that basically had sided with a totalitarian regime. Now, why did it side with a totalitarian regime? Because of the Port of Piraeus, Greek debt, and the rail lines through Hungary. So Greece and Hungary had basically allied with China in the EU to prevent that vote from going forward. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, what was going on. And it's going on in all the institutions.
Yeah. So I think you actually put this, very succinctly when you basically say, we let the promise of cheap labor, inexpensive goods, and rising stock prices ease us into giving up our independence. So what does that really mean to you, right? So what was that promise? And when did that promise sort of start?
Well, you can really point to two major events that I think perpetuated that. So the first one is Tiananmen Massacre. So June 4th, 1989, the students in Tiananmen Square and a lot of other workers within China are protesting the totalitarian regime. and then the regime itself goes into sequestration and starts talking about what's going on. And the three things that it comes to the conclusion of are, number one, that the regime itself, the Communist Party, is under attack by elements from within the society in league with the United States. So the same thing that had just happened to was happening to the Soviet Union, the kind of crumbling of the Soviet Union was now beginning to happen to China. And number two, not only had they gotten economic and financial and science and technology benefit, but they had also gotten some of the principles of democracy, and that's what had led to the ability for the United States to create this havoc in league with others in China. And so no longer going forward could they just be about science and technology and capital with the West. They also needed to promote the ideology, not only in their own society but abroad. And the third thing that they learned was that if they ever became separated from the Chinese people, the Communist Party would fail. And so those were the principles that it drove into redesigning its system so that it could take advantage of all the good from the West without getting any of the democratic principles. And then the second big thing to happen, I think, was WTO.
Yeah.
Because in WTO, in 2001, China is less than $1 trillion in GDP. And from 2001 to now, it grows over 13 times and becomes the number 2 economy in the world. And in the process, in addition to putting its hooks into all of corporate America, Wall Street, academia, and the political system, we take out over 70,000 factories from U.S. industrial base and 3.4 million manufacturing workers. So not only are they getting their hooks into corporate America and finance, but they're also hollowing out what is the engine of our economy that actually allows us to produce the things that defend ourselves. But also, because we've lost now over 13 million jobs, because each of those 3.4 million manufacturing jobs come with 4 support jobs, now we take over 13 million jobs out of the economy that had health benefits and retirement. So now we take out productive capacity, and we levy entitlements on the federal government to pick up. So if you look at by 2007, things are still going well, but by 2018, we've retreated on almost every kind of social score in the United States in terms of the way the population sees how their lives are going.
What I like about this story is that you can see very logically that these steps happen, but what it really is that it happened rapidly, and that American elites and the corporations themselves operate under assumption, you put this out in your book, that this is just normal free market behavior. This is regular disruption, comparative advantage. It's a basic rule that we all learned in Economics 101. What is the counter to that as somebody who believes very much in the opposite view?
Well, so first of all, it wasn't just economic theory, open markets lead to wealth. It was also social theory, the theory of modernization, wealth leads to democracy. And so what happened then is, not only does a businessman then become, you're free to make as much money as you can by offloading, manufacturing capacity to raise your margins, but also you're now a champion of democracy. So it was reinforced in that not only is globalization, and Thomas Friedman did a good job of this, talking about the world is flat, is not only globalization, but you are also doing good for, I think it made it even better, because you could feel like even though you were making these billions of dollars, you were also making the world safe for democracy. And so I think the adoption was very easy. And then you go to these conferences in Davos where the Chinese are saying, yes, globalization is great, and everybody's clapping. And then all the other people that are walking around the cities and the communities of our society in Europe and in Asia and elsewhere where they've seen their productive capacity get taken away. Taiwan is another good example. Mm-hmm. The folks that can't afford to go to Davos or will never even approach Davos are thinking this is not going well. And so it happened so rapidly because it actually, the story was so good. Right. And, if you think about it, even in our own system where we talk about, there's 2 main pillars that help accelerate this, and that is labor and environment. And so we are proud here in the United States of having a very developed labor legal system, a system
Yes.
of protections for labor, and also a system of protections for the environment. So what we did is we take all of the manufacturing capacity in a system that had checks and balances on business to make sure that we were doing it the right way in terms of the share of the wealth going to people that were producing things, but also that we're not poisoning the environment. And we moved it all to a country that exploits the labor and pollutes the environment. So now, you know, and it still is a part of our lexicon. And we say, you know, one good example is the whole idea with fracking. It's better for us to take away our capacity to produce energy in this country and then send our ability to manufacture, because you need energy to manufacture, send our ability over to China to do manufacturing where they have coal-fired plants. So we have natural gas, an abundance of natural gas because of fracking, but we want to take that away and send our manufacturing capacity over to do coal-fired plants to pollute the environment and then also exploit Chinese labor. So there are things that we tell ourselves about promoting democracy, about promoting fair and equitable labor, about promoting fair and equitable trade, and about promoting environmental protections, while at the same time, how we've adopted globalization has actually gone against every one of those principles.
So two things, right? And just to sum up your statements, actually, you say this in the book. The Western dream was basically that you could get rich while promoting democracy. We could we you know, like eat our cake and all that sort of stuff. But to your personal history, so you speak Mandarin, you have had a great interest in China. You also referenced that this book is not anti-Chinese; it's about the Chinese Communist Party. So what drove your initial interest in China, and then when did you start to sort of consider these questions from the perspective you've always come to in 2019?
Yeah, so what drove my interest in China was an opportunity to become an Olmsted Scholar in the Air Force, and it's a program where they send 3 military officers from each branch overseas to a different country each year, and you spend 2 years in that country learning the people. Of course, they send you to language training beforehand, so you go in fluent. So I got to Shanghai in 2002 and traveled all over the country. I went to Tongji University, which is a university in Shanghai, met the people and really lived amongst them for 2 years. And it was a wonderful experience and great people. But what you never really get a full understanding of what's going on in the society because it's that part of it is hidden from you. If you don't go through the education system, if you don't, for example, understand what the People's Armed Police is, and the Ministry.
What is that, right?
So
what
the
is
Ministry of State Security. So these two organs, the People's Armed Police. So the PLA has two. The People's Liberation Army has two components. One is an external facing component that we see, that our military sees. But there's a People's Armed Police that's even a larger contingent of the PLA that actually controls the population. And then you have the Ministry of State Security, which is kind of like the combination CIA and FBI that watches the people. And then you have, all the way down to the individual neighborhoods, neighborhood watch that are Communist Party members. And so that part you don't really experience. Right. So only a few Westerners experience that, particularly if they're getting involved in kind of NGO activities at the local level. But if you're just living there as a businessman, or if you like I was as a student, you go around, you talk to people, you never see the hard edge. And the Chinese Communist Party does a good job of hiding that hard edge from you. So when you see a person and they tell you, we could never have democracy here in China because Chinese people can't deal with democracy, you don't know what goes behind that. You don't know the forced indoctrination. You don't know for instance, if you're not in the Communist Party, you don't ask questions about the political system. That's known to the people, because that's what they get reinforced in school every single day. And so when that piece is taken away, you're left with this very, wonderful picture of China without understanding that dark core. And it wasn't until I was forced as the China advisor to the chairman to essentially work with that dark core, then I began to identify that we have some serious problems because once that's exposed to you, you're like, oh my gosh, this is not the China I experience. By the way, all my interactions with the People's Liberation Army prior to that would be friendly. They're nice.
I hear they're very
people.
polite.
Oh, they're very polite, and they have great parties, and they're always want to be your best friend. But it isn't until you actually deal with them on a day-to-day basis and you begin to understand the system. More importantly, you begin to read their documents.
Yes.
If you read their documents, then you begin to understand that there's a more sinister component to it. And so it really was in 2014 when I started to focus on U.S.-China competition at the Pentagon that I began to realize we were not only we were in a bad position, we were probably in the most consequential, existential fight for our freedoms that we'd ever experienced. Because, quite frankly, it was hovering right below, the eye line for everybody that was supposed to have national security as their imprimatur.
And just quick follow up, in 2004, right? So after your tour finishes up, what were you hopeful about China? Right. So you had that experience. You're interacting with all these people. You see the softer edge of the society. What was your diagnosis then?
Well, my diagnosis was this is a great place. All of my neighbors were working in Fortune 500 companies in the Shanghai Special Economic Zone.
Right.
And so in the 2 years that I was there, I could speak fluently, and sometimes I'd be mistaken for Chinese people when people would talk to me on the phone and then meet me in person. So I had good language skills. I understood kind of how to negotiate after the first year of figuring it out. And I had some, unique cultural insights that, most executives that go over there, most business people that go over there don't spend the time to learn the language. I had learned the language. I kind of understood, the cultural intricacies of negotiation and how to negotiate, and actually help some friends with some things while I was there, that had businesses. And I told my wife, I'm like, I'm going to come back here. And we're going to start a business, and we're going to get rich.
The Chinese dream.
Good. The Western Chinese dream, right?
I'm going to take advantage of the Chinese dream, and I'm like,
become a Wall Street advisor
and this
in
is
China.
This is what we. This is literally what we said. Like
Yeah.
I had another at that time I had another 10 years in the Air Force that I had to pay back because of the 3 years that I'd spent 1 year in language training and 2 years in China. But when that was done, I was coming back to Shanghai, and look out, world, here I come.
That's so fascinating because, and this reminds me of something that was recently said. Matt Stoller, who was recently on this podcast, said that the great dream that we were sold is that we could both make a lot of money and export democracy. And instead, we did make a lot of money, but we've begun importing autocracy to our own country.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating given that own experience that you had, because it is, there's a lot of people, and it seems quite like a friendly place and a place to go make quite a bit of money. And I think the point that I want to make here is it's not that there's bad faith on the part of people who are acting in America on behalf of Chinese interests. It's that it's a failure of government
pursuing
policy.
Ventures.
Or
Right.
pursuing ventures.
Right.
It's not that they're bad people, but this
Yeah,
is
they're
a
not
failure.
traitors. They're
It's
definitely
a
not
failure
traitors.
of government policy, because the government and the state is
Right.
the one who is supposed to make that choice for us.
Yeah, and there's
So when did you start thinking about it from that perspective?
So after I figured out, so what happened was in 2014, in the fall of 2014, one of these contacts I'd made while I was living at the Council on Foreign Relations from 2013 to 2014 sent me a briefing, and the briefing had been made by one of the top 5 accounting firms in the country, and it basically in that briefing it had vignette after vignette after vignette of Chinese or of American companies that had been put under duress by Chinese companies, and the way that they were put under duress demonstrated to me a sophistication, and the only way that analogy that I can give is that here I'd spent 23 years learning how to break societies and using sophisticated air campaigns, and here was a campaign that I was looking at laid out in front of me, where you could do the same exact thing that I could do with a B-2 bomber with JDAMs, except it's done with finance and information.
Yeah.
And I was stunned, quite frankly, because I realized at that point that I did not know. My mind broke, because I realized at that point I didn't know how the world worked.
Yeah.
The world was working differently than it had been portrayed. The liberal order that we were building was actually not providing a national security for Americans. Because if you think about it, from a military sense, because I think in pictures, and one of the pictures that came to my mind as I looked at this was, Dresden after the Air Force gets done with it, and then if you look at Detroit after China enters the WTO, I mean, it's bombed out neighborhoods. It's destroyed
socially, culturally,
industrial base.
Yeah.
Yes, and you realize that you can do the same things that we did in World War II or even in Iraq. You can do that with ones and zeros and dollars and cents in a globalized world, but you can do it in ways that it's really imperceptible.
Yes.
It's imperceptible because you just tell the people, you hear this all the time. Americans are lazy, right? They're non-productive. They're lazy. And
Chinese believe this.
They're taught this.
And American elites.
They're
But
taught,
it's not just
this.
there's
But yet nobody. I have a good friend whose father was one of the ones that would go around and dismantle these factories that were sold to China, and it's seared into his mind walking through these places and seeing the workstations and seeing the pictures of their children and the mementos of a life that were left behind, and so these factories closed. They shut the door. They put a lock on the door, and these people couldn't even get their personal belongings out. And their everything, their livelihood, not just their livelihood, their life was gone, was ripped from them, and it was as if the United States had faced a long-term air campaign that slowly destroyed it, but it was imperceptible, and that's where the whole the idea for stealth war comes from, because it was a hidden war. It was a war that we couldn't see. In fact, it was a war that we blamed on ourselves, because if we would have just been harder working like the Chinese, then we would have been. Then it wouldn't have happened to us.
So there's a lot of debate in this country right now. Is China an existential threat to the United States? Even if the answer is yes, what is its actual global ambition? So does it seek to dominate Asia, or does it seek to displace the United States on the world stage explicitly?
So you got to go to what it believes. When I say what it believes, what the Communist Party believes. Mm-hmm. The Communist Party believes in kind of the return of the China that dominated the world scene for 5,000 years.
Right.
And that China is the best way that they say it. It's like all the sunflowers turning toward the sun. The sunflowers being all the nations of the world turning toward the sun, which is China. That's what they believe. They believe that China is a center of that's where Zhongguo comes from, middle country. It is a center, and they want to reestablish that. They've had a bad 100 years, the century of humiliation, but they're back, and they're going to be back with a vengeance. And they believe this wholeheartedly, that in almost a supremacy, but only if led by the Chinese Communist Party. What's interesting about that whole theory is that yes, they were one of the primary agrarian economies for 5,000 years, and were somewhat what's the word I'm looking for? Consistent in terms of their society. While other, kind of herding economies, that weren't agrarian, kind of came and went, and there was a bunch of wars. Sure. Yeah. But since then, the rest of the world has actually developed. So now we have an information economy. So the idea that just because you were the dominant nation for 5,000 years, that you would be so again, actually is a little bit presumptuous if you think about it. But going back to your point about recognizing what's going on, and then what is what is happening that are in a policy sense that you could see and you could point to and say, well, why are we doing this? Is really stupid. And one of the biggest ones is the idea that we would send our retirement funds over to invest in companies that aren't required to maintain normal audit or transparency requirements. And so as you started to peel apart, in one of the books that I read, during this time in 2014, as we were going through this, was Pillsbury's book, and what I would always recommend after I read the book was that you read the last chapter and you kind of get the gist, which is the federal government's basically giving everything to the Chinese. But I think the difference between what I looked at And what he looked at is it was far more focused on the military, where I was far more focused on economic and financial.
And that's what's actually fascinating here, because aside from you being a fellow member of the Hudson family, we wanted to talk with you because you directly tie the economic picture to the military picture. Because if we're thinking of the previous Cold War with the Soviet Union, the thing that was totally different was they were not a pure economic competitor in the way that China is. Like, obviously, the Soviet Union had a massive economy, but they weren't creating next generation technologies. We weren't competing with them over AI. We weren't competing. Our economies are sort of closed off from each other. So is there a sort of difficulty amongst our sort of political, financial, military elite sector of, I think, comprehending the tie between these two things? Like, comprehending that if you talk about our China policy, you have to actually focus on what's happening in the Midwest. You actually have to talk about Detroit. How have you sort of experienced that dynamic?
Well, yeah, and if you think about it, the way we've taught people that do business today is that you do it primarily through financial wizardry. Mm-hmm. You don't build things anymore, and I think that's and then you have that component of it where business is really about how do I increase my margins every year. It's not about how do I make a better product, mm-hmm. right? It's not about how do I make a better community yes. where I'm making my product. It's really about how do I increase my margins. And usually that's by offshoring the things that I do. But in a national security sense,
like complicated debt structures.
Exactly. These financial instruments that nobody can figure out what you're buying. But hey, sure. If you can't figure out what you're buying, then that should make it even more expensive.
Right. Yeah. There's a system, man. You would have been successful if you'd gone to Shanghai.
So
you really should have
done that. Yeah. But in national security, there was another component going on, whereas we were high on our own competency, mm-hmm. and the other piece to this is that the Chinese, seeing that, it reinforced in them that was not the area that they wanted to compete with.
This was Iraq, right? So I've heard this before, which is the tale is that the Chinese saw the invasion of Iraq and they had to turn everything around. They said, whoa, this is not, we cannot compete on this particular field. We will have to heavily invest in our military, but if we're going to take on the West, it will have to be through different types of instrumentation. Now, how has that clashed with your own experience in the military? This is not the way that things were taught in terms of warfare from this all-out, peer competitor while you were coming up in the Pentagon. So what was that change like for you?
Well, I mean, I think what you have to do is begin to the first thing that I looked at was just what's the military balance, mm-hmm. right? And what you're faced with so you have to put Iraq and Afghanistan away, because what you're faced with when you're not facing a nuclear power is that we have military superiority in the conventional sense.
Stealth bombers.
Yeah. Right. We have JDAMs. We have all this stuff. I mean, it's just we when you go against a country like that isn't as sophisticated in the way it applies the same tools, by the way, that Amazon does, except it delivers bombs.
Right.
Then it's a completely different story. And so what you find in the Pentagon is that everybody wanted to be in that story, because when it got to the Chinas and the Russias of the world, then what the Chinese realized, and what we should have realized, is that war between those types of nations really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because now you're talking about where does escalation stop.
Right.
And we have a lot of discussion about escalation ladders, and of course Hudson Institute has a long history of nuclear theory. But the bottom line is, what the Chinese came to the conclusion of, okay, we're not going to fight. That's stupid.
Don't jujitsu. Don't lean in.
We don't want to fight with weapons, because that means we could have nuclear weapons. And so we would want to engage them like the Russians. And I participated in a lot of these talks in terms of strategic stability. And they would just say, we're not going to talk about it. We're going to have a few nuclear weapons. We're going to make sure that you can't destroy them all so that we can hit you. That'll make sure that you won't want to hit us, mm-hmm. and that's all we need.
They don't have that many relative
They don't
to us,
have
right?
that many, and they don't want that many. They don't care about that many. They just want us to know that if we hit them, they have the capacity to hit us back.
Second strike.
Right, for a second strike. They want to have a secured second strike, but they don't want to spend too much money for it, and they don't want to spend too much money in their military, because these things that you're taught in college that start to come back up. This whole argument about guns and butter. They want to spend more on butter than they do on guns. We've become more about guns than we have about butter. And so when you start to look at, okay, here's the military balance, it's going wacko, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But then they're spending more on butter and we're spending more on guns. And then you go back and you start thinking historically how this played out. You realize, oh my gosh, this is the way we just defeated the Soviet Union. And then you're sitting in there in your cubicle in the Pentagon.
Making them to overspend on military.
Yeah, and you're sitting in your cubicle in the Pentagon, you realize, oh my God.
So
They've basically reversed on us, and now they're running our play that we played on the Soviet Union, and it's working. We're buying into it. Not only do we spend $800 billion on defense, we're saying we need to spend more and more and more. And so then you have to take a step back and you're like, okay, what are the elements of a good strategy that can actually carry us through? And you have to go back then to Eisenhower. And what Eisenhower said was, in particular, and this is getting directly to the military balance, I think it was 1958, they did a calculation that it would cost $23 billion in 1958 to protect 70% of the population from all those ICBMs that the Soviets were building. And it would cost 6 times that to protect 90% of the population. But the more important number was that for every dollar of offense they added, we had to spend $6 more on defense. It was a failed strategy economically. We would go broke before the Soviet Union did. And so that's where we got mutually assured destruction. We said, okay, economically this is much more feasible because we can spend money on the offense easier than we can on the defense, and we can just tell the Russians, hey, if you do anything, it's going to be all out.
Yeah.
And so that became our strategy. So what did we do with that $6 that we saved? We poured it into the Eisenhower National Highway System. We poured it into basic science research, like the space race. We poured it into STEM education. So all those scientists that were educated, that's where our money went. That was Eisenhower's strategy. We carried that strategy through all the way through the Soviet Union. And eventually they spent themselves into bankruptcy trying to keep up with our technological prowess because they did the guns over butter. If you look at that and you look at the elements that were hanging over from that, the biggest element that was hanging over from that was making it difficult for us in a conventional sense, because there's 3 offsets, right? First offset was nuclear offset. Second offset was the kind of the Perry, stealth aircraft, precision weapons and GPS navigation, all of those things. Third offset was the one that Deputy Secretary Work tried to institute when he came into the Pentagon along with Ash Carter. Well, if you look at the first two, the first one is done because we believe that the Soviets have gained economics or nuclear superiority over us. So we go to build nuclear weapons and we stop doing conventional. The second one is, okay, they've gotten back to nuclear parity, so now we need to do something else. We're going to do conventional technological superiority. And then when we get to the third, we've basically given up our ability to do that. So you take that strategy, you run it again, and you say, what were the elements of that strategy? The elements of that strategy were the Soviet Union was isolated economically from democracies, and we were investing most of our excess capacity in terms of our tax base into the country itself, so in manufacturing base, infrastructure, STEM education, research and development. So if you do that, you cut them off, and you invest in the country, you deter them with weapons, and you begin to grow the economic and science and technological superiority of your country, then you have a way out. More importantly, in the conventional sense, what the third offset should have been, and what I tried to, I actually briefed McMaster when he was at the Army Future Command back in 2015, is let's pull out of the INF Treaty, right? The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Because remember I said it was for every dollar of offense, we were spending $6 of defense. Now in the Pacific, for every dollar of defense that China spends, we spend $30 of offense trying to project power in.
Yeah.
So the idea that the INF Treaty prevented us from actually having an efficient way of providing weaponry in the region to actually counter their conventional superiority in ballistic missiles. That's why, so we were actually talking about getting rid of the INF Treaty back in 2014 at the Pentagon, how do you generate that when you have all of these nuclear arms experts saying we should never ever come out of the INF Treaty?
So this is what you're all getting at. This is what the title of the book is: Stealth War, which is that the war that we are now fighting with China is not one of bullets and bombs. It's about ones and zeros, dollars and cents, financialized instruments, economic data, and ultimately it's about the productive capacity of a healthy nation and using that to overpower your enemy. Now, it seems to me that China has understood that now for almost, 25 years since the Deng Xiaoping era. Now, why have Western leaders been so slow to grasp this?
Well, I think because we were so drunk on our superiority and military capability that we thought that meant national security.
Yeah.
So we equated military capability to national security, when in reality, and we in professional military education, we're taught about diplomatic, informational, military, and economic power, but we're really only focused on military power. And in fact, when I started briefing that briefing that I got back in 2014 to all the 4-stars in the military, the response I got was, "Holy shit, this is bad."
I'm not sure if we could curse here, are we, Phil?
But number two,
FCC, all right.
number two, that's not my job, right? I'm supposed to fight.
Right.
You want to talk about national security? Let's talk about ships and planes and tanks. I don't know how to talk about ones and zeros and dollars and cents. And I will say one other thing, and this is kind of where I focused in the latter half of my time at the White House, and that is the strategic nature of data in a 21st century economy, and the fact that in our system, our system of government has always been kind of upheld by our system of economy. And in particular, you had the ability as a man or a woman in the United States to maintain your freedoms to the extent that we did by maintaining, essentially ownership of your own property, right? In a physical sense, you own your own property. And the thing that in addition to the rule of law, that protects you not just from your neighbor, but also from an oppressive government is the Second Amendment. And so as you start to break apart the digital world and you say, okay, the Second Amendment, if this experiment in democracy fails, where we've basically distributed power sufficiently so no one person, group, or party can gain ultimate power, then we give the citizen the ability through the Second Amendment to fight an oppressive government. But what you saw happening as you looked at this economic and financial and digital connection between the Communist Party and other totalitarian regimes in the United States was that in many ways we didn't know who was oppressing us. And what I'm talking about here is the case of the Russians influencing protests after the 2016 elections, where they use artificial AI bots. They use big data analysis, and social networks to drive protests. So you realize you could use your data against you to influence you in ways that were counter to your nation's interests. That in order to get back control of that, you needed to have control of your data, and in order to maintain democracy in a digital world. And the thing that requires that, or that upholds that we've seen this in the case of San Bernardino is encryption.
Right.
The ability to have control of your data because only you have control over it. Now, in our own society, we fight over this conflict between the FBI and DOJ having access to your data, and you saying, "Hey, no, I'm an American. I deserve privacy." And one of the things that terrorism kind of in 9/11 drove in our society is this idea that we want to have the government have pervasive knowledge of what's going on in our society. Well, that's a very dangerous path to walk down. That's what China has. And that's where I think in the last half of my time at the White House, I focused on how do we maintain democracy in the digital world, and it's really about encryption.
So I think the thing that we'll wrap up with it, because you have a great sort of call to action in the book, which we have 3 years to reverse course. So sort of A, why do we have 3 years? And B, what do we need to do to sort of along the sort of lines you've outlined here?
Well, I think I've actually extended that timeline because I think a lot of the actions that the Trump administration has taken has bought us some time. I think putting
Like what?
Huawei on the entity list. I think starting to do the tariffs. Now this is starting. I like the Petraeus analogy that he used in Iraq, throwing sand in the gears of your enemy. I think we've thrown a bunch of sand in the gears of our enemy. So that 3-year timeline, each time we do that, it gets extended out. But all that does is give us the opportunity to then work on our nation. And so now I think we have some time. We need to focus on securing our digital borders as much as we secure our air, space, and land and sea around the United States and other democracies, and invest in our country and protect our institutions, finance, trade, investment, immigration, media, politics, academia, and internet. Understand that they're all under attack. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of it.
Well, this is where I do have to interject, General. How do you protect institutions which have financial incentives to not be protected? Because
or to claim there's not a threat.
Yeah, or claim that there's not a threat, which is, as the recent NBA issue has shown, there is a financial incentive for the richest and most famous amongst us to side with our enemies over their own citizens. Right. That is a cultural reversal, which you're not going to be able to reverse in 3 years.
Right, and so the reason I wrote so first of all, the reason I retired from the Air Force, I didn't complete my term as a 1-star. I asked for an early waiver, and I was granted an early waiver to retire as a 1-star. I could have kept going. The reason I got out was to write this book and take this story on the road to the American people, because I think and what I write in the book is what the Chinese Communist Party failed to recognize is the power of the Constitution, the power that each person in this country has a vote, and collectively they can rise up and say, we are not going to take this anymore. And I think they have today unspecified anxiety about what's going on in their lives. Why, when I walk around, I see bombed out neighborhoods. They don't know. They've been told it was their fault,
right?
Because they're too lazy or unproductive to actually provide for themselves. What nobody told them is, no, it's your elites in league with the Chinese Communist Party that are conspiring to take away your wealth and your democracy, and you need to rise up and ask for redress of your government to fix that. And I think your point about it is government that is responsible for protecting the American people, provide for the common defense. And if in the manner in which that is done in a 21st century globalized world is different, then they have the obligation to change and do that. And so it is, thank God we have a Constitution. Thank God we have American people that can stand up and say, okay, you guys on the right and the left, you've been mucking it up. Time to fix it. And I think that's why we're here today. That's why we have more time than 3 years, because I think Trump's an unconventional president. But I think one of the things that if you listen to him, he actually listens to what the people are saying. Yeah. They're saying we've got drugs in our neighborhoods. Yes, because China's pumping fentanyl in. They're saying we don't have jobs. Yes, because we sold them all to China so that we could have higher margins. He got that. He ran on that message. He got elected on that message. And I think whoever gets elected in 2020 is going to get elected on the very same message. So only now they'll know it's not just, they're not lazy. They're fine. They're okay. It's we basically made this pact with the Chinese Communist Party.
On that note, General,
that's that.
Don't think we can ever end on anything else. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.